Welcome to Module 3. In the last module, we addressed more of the rules we need to follow in order to develop good requirement statements. In particular, we looked at the rules that relate to the use of vague and superfluous words. In this module, we address more of those rules, starting with some more rules about other words we should avoid when writing requirements. And in particular, we look at avoiding conjunctions unless we introduce a formal convention for logical conditions. We also discuss why we have to avoid unbounded statements and escape clauses. In the last presentation, we addressed the first few of the rules that we need to follow in order to develop good requirement statements. In this presentation, we address more of those rules, starting with some more rules about terms that we should avoid when writing text-based requirements. We discussed in the last presentation a number of rules for avoiding vague words because their use leads to ambiguity. In that vein, we should also avoid the use of conjunctions. A conjunction is a word used to connect clauses in a sentence or to connect terms inside a clause. So conjunctions are words such as and, or, then, and else, but, however, whether, meanwhile, whereas, and otherwise. And it also would include in this rule phrases such as well as, but also, on the other hand, which are other ways of saying those conjunctions. We should also avoid the oblique symbol, as we might use it, and commonly in English we might use it as and/or, because it's even worse than using either conjunction on its own. It's not even clear what that construct means often. It could mean one of them, or both, or not. So the presence of conjunctions in a requirement statement usually indicates that there are multiple requirements, and each should be written in a separate statement. Not only that, the words also create ambiguity. Let's look at some examples. So the first reason for avoiding conjunctions is to ensure that requirement statements are singular. Now remember, we're trying to write a single sentence to encapsulate a single requirement. So for example, if we say, the user interface shall display the location and identity of the lead vehicle, it's in fact stating two requirements through the use of the conjunction and. And we should split it to say that the user interface shall display the location of the lead vehicle and it shall display the identity of the lead vehicle in two separate sentences. Now, of course, there are occasions when the two requirements are to be met at the same time. We call those simultaneous requirements, or we use the word simultaneity to relate to those two requirements being needed at the same time. In that case, we need to use a formal logical construct, and we'll discuss that shortly. Note also that the requirements must be split because the verification statement written for each requirement will also be different. For example, the requirement statement, the vehicle shall have a maximum speed of and a maximum range of, should be split into two requirements, one related to maximum speed and the other to maximum range, because they are in fact two requirements, but also because the maximum range will be verified in a different manner to that we use to verify the speed. The second reason we wish to avoid conjunctions is that presence almost always creates ambiguity. So for example, consider this requirement. The maintenance staff shall fertilise and spray weeds on the grass area. Now we saw earlier that the presence of the conjunction results in two actions, which warns us that there are in fact two requirements. However here, the ambiguity causes issues about how we might even split it. So for example, it could mean that the maintenance staff should fertilise and then spray the weeds that are on the grass areas, or they should fertilise the grass areas and then spray the weeds on the grass areas. Common sense would imply the latter, but in some cases the interpretation is not so easy to come across. Similarly, the conjunction or should be avoided because it often hides multiple requirements, but also because it often leads to ambiguity. So for example, the requirement, the system shall provide an audible or visible alarm, is ambiguous because it's a moot point whether the designer can choose which alarm to implement or whether both alarms should exist, but the operator can select one, or whether both exist and operate, but the system passes its verification test if only one of the alarms alerts the operator. Despite the fact that they introduce ambiguity, as we mentioned earlier, there may be times when we need to state logical requirements that require us to use the conjunctions and or. So conjunctions may be used in requirement statements when used in the context of logical operators. In that case, however, the terms are normally written in all capitals or italics to show that they're used as operators rather than as conjunctions. So we might write "and" in capitals or "and" in italics, "or" in capitals or in italics. And so, for example, we might say the user interface shall display the location and identity of lead vehicle, implying that both are to be displayed at the same time. Now, that requirement needs rewriting. Notice that the user interface shall display the location and the identity of the lead vehicle actually leaves the relationship between the location and the lead vehicle in abeyance. What we could do, strictly speaking, is make sure that we are writing it carefully to say that the user interface shall display the location of the lead vehicle and the identity of the lead vehicle. That now leads to a little ambiguity because it's not clear whether the "and" joins words, phrases or clauses. To be absolutely sure that there's no ambiguity, a convention for logical conditions uses a formal structure to ensure that it's clear as to what elements of the requirement are joined by the "and" or the "or." For example, in this case, we could isolate the elements between curly brackets or square brackets so that it's clear in either of these two statements that the conditions being joined are those inside the brackets. Further ambiguity is introduced by the use of phrases such as "and so on," etc., but not limited to. As we saw before, if the authors of the requirement statement require all items in a list, each of those items must be specified explicitly. Use of phrases such as "and so on" leads to ambiguity because it allows different interpretations as to which of the items is in such an open-ended list. Further, the requirement is not met until it has been verified for all elements in the list. If the list is incomplete or implied to be infinite, verification activities cannot be completed. So, for example, the system shall display the account balance, the account holder, and so on has two problems. First, the list is potentially endless and the requirements need to be split because of the conjunction. So more correctly, the system shall display the account balance, the system shall display the account holder, followed by any additional statements if there are other items to be displayed. In addition to being open-ended, requirements authors are often tempted to generalize, using such phrases as "where possible," "if practicable," "if necessary," "as much as possible," and "where possible." These are escape clauses, which, in an acquirer-supplier relationship, may allow the supplier to have an excuse not to bother with such a requirement by simply stating that in their view, it wasn't possible, necessary, or practicable. In this presentation, we addressed more of the rules we need to follow in order to develop good requirement statements. In the next presentation, we complete our discussion of things to avoid when writing good text-based requirements. So now you know a little bit more about requirements writing and why it's so important to get the requirements right before we go any further with the system's development. Once again, please go back through the presentation until you're comfortable. Then you can confirm that you absorbed the material by completing the module quiz. In the next module, we complete our look at the rules for writing requirements by considering precision, units, ranges and tolerances, and cross-references.